dream of a nation where freedom would endure. The working prayers of centuries have brought us to this day. What shall be our legacy? What will our children say? Let them say of me, I was one who believed in sharing the blessings I received. Let me know in my heart when my days are through. America, America, I gave my best to you. Each generation, from the plains to distant shore, with the gifts
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. It's great to be here with you in community. For those of you I haven't yet had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Caitlin Brune, and I have the great privilege of serving as NCG's Senior Fellow this year. And in that capacity, I've been trying to bring forward work that uplifts this connection between the inner work of social change and how we show up and do our philanthropic work to bring about a world that's more just and inclusive and compassionate. I wanted to just start by inviting you to get comfortable. We're together here for the next 90 minutes or so, and just to take a few breaths and release whatever you were doing before this, whatever you don't need in this moment, and to just gather your attention and settle your body here for our time together. And as we gather, I also would love to call in our ancestors and all our relations. I want to acknowledge that I stand on land stewarded across time by the Awaswas Amamutsun people and the coastal Ohlone natives. I'm aware that I dwell on stolen land, tended by stolen people. And I want to present this country's history of genocide and chattel slavery, unhealed wounds that we are called to attend to collectively by working actively with love toward repair and justice. I believe that nobody is free until we all are free, living in safety with full dignity, inclusion, and opportunity. And I think we must see our history clearly and acknowledge those still connected to the struggle for self determination and liberation so that we can participate in transforming hurt into accountability and healing. And if you'd like to find out whose land you're standing on, my colleague Nepthali has dropped a link in the chat that can help you with that. So, our plans for today, we're going to have a few opening remarks and setting of the context. And then I'm going to hand over to two amazing colleagues, Serena Khan of the Women's Foundation of California and Jamie Allison of the Haas Fund. to enter into deeper conversation about this moment in our nation's history, our community's history, this moment in philanthropy. And you can use the Q&A function to drop your questions in the chat. We hope to have sorry to drop your questions in because we hope to feed those into the conversation and have a nice engaging discussion. And feel free to use the chat to provide some feedback, some love, some encouragement, some observations. We're also going to use a few real time polls throughout to keep things engaging. So at those moments, watch the chat, and my colleague Neptali will drop a link in there, and you can use your phone or your computer to participate. I want to say thanks to the Women's Foundation of California for co sponsoring this event with us. So, as we begin, I just wanted to presence that we're in the afterglow of an historic day, bright with promise, albeit also tinged with fear and uncertainty from recent shadow filled days in which the specter of white supremacy darkened our national seat of democracy. After a year of pandemic and persecution, climate catastrophes and civil agitation, uprisings and unbelievable organizing, and a myriad of other demands on us, there's little wonder that so many are still traumatized and exhausted, not yet able to embrace the possibilities of this new national administration. Many remain weary and concerned, tentatively awaiting the tide to turn. And we see evidence that the tide is turning. Within the philanthropic and social sector, this past year saw significant movement toward the practices of trust based philanthropy. We witnessed new awakenings to the power of harnessing all forms of philanthropic assets in service of racial and gender justice. We've seen demonstrations of creativity, innovation, and generosity at a time that certainly demanded these. We've also noted backsliding, stasis, and the disturbing extent to which philanthropy powered an administration that fanned hate and condoned misogyny, racism, and violence. Indeed, I think we in the philanthropic sector still have much work to do in order to use this transitional moment to redress historic wrongs, redistribute power and resources, and take up the hard labor of healing and reweaving civic and communal life. I'm asking, how might we open to the possibilities inherent in centering accountability and love, generosity and good stewardship, individual and collective well being? Where and how must those of us proximate to resources, holders of power and privilege, humble ourselves to respond to the demands of Black, Indigenous, and people of color colleagues and movement activists? How can we intentionally situate power and privilege where they have not always landed, but so sincerely need to be if we are to progress toward an invigorated democracy? Here to help us explore these very small questions are two formidable, graceful, gifted leaders. Serena Khan, CEO of the Women's Foundation of California, and Jamie Allison, Executive Director of the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. We hosted Serena and Jamie back in June to harvest reflections from the early days of the pandemic and wanted to double back and glean their latest insights. Serena and Jamie, it's so great to have you here. I won't go into detailed biographies, which you can find on the webpage for this event, but I will note that these two leaders both reached for powerful antidotes to fear, uncertainty, and perceived scarcity. They've reached for unfailing generosity and the centering of wellness. And here they are to tell you more.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Caitlin. And thank you for modeling that there can be no reconciliation without truth. So as we begin our conversation about wellness and generosity, I too would like to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the unceded land of the Waso people. I'd like to extend a warm welcome again to all of you joining us for this conversation. I know that several of my colleagues from the Walter and Elise Haas Fund are here, as well as my sisters from New Universal and a dear friend from the Whitman Institute. Oh, thanks for that. My face just popped up really large on my screen. For those of you who are here, who are in my close friend and colleague circle, you'll no doubt hear and see yourselves in my comments and my questions today, because so much of my learning and growth have come in deep relationship with you. Let's get started. As Caitlin just mentioned, Serena and I were in conversation last June, and we're interested to know if any of you attended that first conversation. So could you use the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to indicate if you joined us in June? Oh, and I am just noticing that I don't know if I can see raised hands on my screen.
It's in the participant section. So I'm noticing, Jamie, that there's a handful of people. So maybe like a quarter of the people were here in June. We just wanted to make sure that we were appropriately repeating ourselves if necessary.
Great. Thank you for those of you who've returned to this conversation, and I'm excited to greet all of you who are here for the first time. Caitlin invoked the wisdom of our youngest poet laureate, Amanda Gorman, and let's start by talking about the context, the national context in which we do our work, the state of the nation. A few days before the inauguration, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that multiculturalism was not American. I disagree with this wholeheartedly, and after witnessing yesterday's inauguration of the Biden-Harris administration, I felt an energetic shift. Yesterday, we saw a glimpse of the nation we could become. Serena, what's your vision for what we can become and what role philanthropy can play in that?
Well, I just want to say thank you for raising that. I mean, I think we absolutely are a multicultural country and state especially. And so I just want to start by saying that I am breathing such a sigh of relief after yesterday. And, you know, there was so much leading up to it that I, like many people, I think was scared. Would we get to yesterday? Would people be safe yesterday? And so I'm kind of trying to get used to the fact that what is it going to feel like to hear some good news every day versus the bad news that we were repeatedly faced with. So I'm just glad to see that there is a level of civility and compassion and integrity and strategy that is back in our White House and in our national leadership. And so, you know, starting actually certainly with the first day actions yesterday, but even before the day before yesterday, I was so glad to see the Biden-Harris administration announce the White House Gender Policy Council, and that, you know, and for Ambassador Rice, Susan Rice, who's the domestic policy advisor to President Biden, to say, from healthcare, the economy, education, and national security, every issue is a women's issue. And so I think that in terms of the vision for the future is that we really have to make sure that we're centering gender and race and economic prosperity and security in everything that we talk about. So I think that there's so much opportunity, even though we are still living in a crisis. But I really do believe, I am an eternal optimist, that in every crisis there's also opportunity. And we at the Women's Foundation California have experienced that over the last year, that this is, you know, that COVID has really shined a light on everything that was wrong with our policies, our communities. And so it's not that we want to go back to the normal that we had before, but to create a new normal and to redesign and restructure and move forward and center ourselves in our values, which is what we've done over the past year with, you know, I'm glad to say, a huge amount of, you know, wonderful things that have happened in the midst of this crisis that we're living through.
Yeah. Part of our theme today in our conversation is about wellness, and I cried a lot yesterday, and it really wasn't until yesterday morning and the ceremonies, and I was so incredibly moved. I hadn't recognized just how much trauma I was carrying in my body every day. And then to wake up this morning and read the news and not feel enraged by every headline was just such a relief and a release in a different way of starting my day than I've started many days. I'm sure many of us have started many days seeing the headlines and going into day feeling overwhelmed and overburdened. And it was such a relief not to wake up to trauma and agony this morning. I'd like to try our interactive polling. Serena, I have a question for you that I'd also like everyone with us here in this session to respond to. When the prompt appears on the screen, you just click the link and then you enter your response into the text box. And this is a fill in the blank question, a fill in the blank with one word. So reflecting on this moment for philanthropy, I feel.
I feel trust. That has been very important to me. That's my one word, trust. But while people are thinking about theirs, I'll just explain why it's important to me, because I really think that it's important for us to put trust in our movement leaders so that they can focus on their work and not the bureaucracies of applying for funding. And at Women's Foundation California, we know that because we're both a grant speaker and a grant maker. And so we're very familiar with what it takes to apply for funding. And we want to make sure that we are really modeling the best of philanthropy. And that means that we trust our community partners to do the work. And in particular, you know, we were founded by a group of women in 1979 who left us with a founding principle that has been core to our work ever since, which is that people who are closest to problems in their communities are also closest to the solutions. And so we really have to look and resource those communities in order to figure out how to move forward, and that has to happen with trust.
Thank you. As the word cloud continues to populate, I'd like to lift up a comment in the chat from Didi, who says, I think it's important to recognize that 70 million Americans are now feeling that same trauma around the news. Those that did not vote for Biden and sadly are still supporting the Trump movement, those people are feeling as awful as we did 4 years ago. I couldn't agree more, Didi. In fact, last night at home, I was having a conversation to express that in some ways I feel guilty for the peace and calm and I dare say joy that I feel in this moment, recognizing that for the last 4 years there were a different set of people who finally felt seen and heard and validated the way I might feel now. And so I think the question for all of us, and I'll ask you this question as well, Serena, is how might we go about in this rebuilding of our communities, in this rebuilding of our countries, how might we engage each other, particularly those who do not share the same views, let's say today or yesterday? How might we come together to hear each other, to acknowledge each other's pain and build something different together?
Yeah, I think that, I appreciate that comment. I mean, I think that this is not new. We have had deep divisions in this country for a long time. I know from the early part of my career, I was a research analyst studying different sectors of the right at Political Research Associates. And while I studied very specifically the anti-LGBT religious right, I had colleagues there that studied far-right militia movements. And so this has been building for quite a while. It's not new, and it doesn't go away with this election. So it's absolutely true that there are millions of people, hopefully fewer now than 70 million, that voted for the previous administration in the last election, given what happened with the insurrection on January 6th. I think we've seen some falling away from that base, but certainly not enough. And I think how we have to approach that is a lesson that I learned very early on from one of my mentors who has since passed away, Jean Hardesty, who said that we really have to distinguish between leaders and followers. And it's leaders who are often setting the agenda. And so to scapegoat or demonize the followers is not going to help us in any way. I think that if we are truly about movement building, then we have to move people. That is the job. And so that means that we have to meet people where they are. We have to listen. We have to approach our work with compassion and generosity. And so I think that we, and this involves culture change, which is also a very significant part of our work at Women's Foundation California, is that, we have to figure out how to reach people so that they begin to understand and perhaps agree with a vision of democracy, a vision of justice, where they can see that they are included in that and that ultimately everybody will benefit. And that requires us to use a range of different tools. And in philanthropy, we've done that very well in terms of, funding organizing, funding coalition building, funding strategic communications, funding policy advocacy. And I think we have a great opportunity to fund culture change and using art and music and other forms that people really respond to shift that mindset. And that's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen in a year or even 4 years.
We're certainly at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund starting to have conversations about how we can be part of some of that bridge building work as an arts funder. Just this week, we were starting to talk about the role of the arts in facilitating those kinds of conversations and the cultural shift that needs to happen to build common ground and our connections to each other. Serena, as you reflect on the past and 2020 specifically, what habits, system, ways of thinking do you think we need to leave behind in order to make the most of this transformative moment? Another way of asking this question is, what are you ready to release and what are you ready to claim?
Well, let me start with what I'm ready to claim and kind of bring into the future. I think that, you know, and maybe this will sound familiar to some people who are on the call in June, but just as a way of recapping, you know, as soon as we started working from home, which was the week of March 9th, we began to do things very differently. And I think instinctually for me, as you know, leading this organization, I wanted to make sure that our team and our community partners were safe and had the sort of space and time to process the magnitude of everything that was going on. So we immediately began to make some changes, and that of course started with conversation on the team. And so they, you know, might sound like small things, but now that we have kind of the rear view mirror, you know, these changes did a lot for us as a team and for the amount of support we were able to give to our community partners. And initially we went, you know, from things like a monthly staff meeting, the staff said we want to check in weekly if we're going to be in the virtual space. And then, you know, our director of community investment, Hung Nguyen Yap, said, can we send supplemental grants to our community partners? They might not have Zoom memberships or laptops. And so we immediately wired money to our core grant partners, and that set up was the genesis for our Relief and Resilience Fund. And so we early on had the infrastructure to be responsive and do it quickly. And so we also began to see spikes in domestic violence in every one of California's 58 counties. We developed a partnership with Blue Shield of California Foundation and got funding out to every single domestic violence shelter organization in the state. That's more than 130 organizations, and we did it in a matter of weeks. And in the meantime, what was happening on the staff was, you know, people had, you know, had caregiving responsibilities, whether for kids or elders in their families or communities. And so we moved to a 4-day work week, knowing that there was research out there from organizations like Rockwood and Third Wave Fund that, you know, some organizations can become more productive when you're working on a 4-day work week. And that has certainly been true for us. We increased benefits, technology benefits, recognizing that people's utility bills and other kinds of things may go up as they're working from home. We tried to think about what were other barriers. So we had like a fitness reimbursement policy that you had to opt into. And we thought, why should it be opt-in? It should be opt-out, because we noticed that about 7 people weren't opting in. And so we thought, let's just make it so that you have to opt out and you can use the wellness benefit for anything at all, whether it's an online yoga class or mental health issues or snacks or whatever. We don't really care as long as it's helping you. So we really centered the wellness of our team. And we did it with centering generosity and abundance. And similarly with our partners. And what that ultimately did, and this wasn't some part of some master plan, but as people saw that, the generosity came back to us. And so we began to see, you know, significantly increased giving from our donor community, which is very diverse. It includes, in fact, grant partners and our Women's Policy Institute fellows, as well as high net wealth people. And then that allowed us to make almost $10 million in grants this past year, which is more than we've done in any given year. And we do it again through a trust-based system where we'll take applications on the phone, via video. We don't require, you know, rigid reporting requirements. We just say, send us what you have, and that will, you know, spark a conversation. And just the other day, you know, Hung on our staff sent a note that she wanted to share from a new grant partner. And I just want to read it to you because it means so much to me. And this is one of many kinds of notes that we've gotten, which is, we very much appreciate the process of being invited to share about our work by phone, and then invited within a week to complete this short form to receive general operating support for our work. The simplicity and rapid responsiveness of the process makes sure we can spend more time doing the work rather than writing about it in a proposal. General operating support enables us to allocate the funds to strengthen our current work rather than having to create a new project. Thank you for this simple and trust-based process. And that feedback means the world to me, because that is ultimately what we were setting out to do, which is to, say, focus on your work, not on writing about it in a proposal.
Wow, that is such a beautiful note. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing so many concrete examples about what an abundance mindset can look like internally inside the organization. I remember when your Medium post came out, when you talked about how feminist leadership was important during a crisis, and just ask maybe Caitlin and Neftali can find a link to that article and put it in the chat so that folks who haven't seen that article penned by Serena could see it now. And I remember seeing it, and I was going to say I went into the office, which is not true, because we were working from home. My language hasn't yet quite caught up with where with how we work now, all remote. But I remember reading your piece and immediately going to Anna and Suki, who are on the call today, to say, look at this list. How many of these things are we doing already? And we were really pleased to see that we were doing a number of them already, and to say how many of these things that we might not be doing might we be able to incorporate into our work. So I want to thank you for your leadership in making public the things that you're doing internally at your foundation. I don't know how many people will get to tell you, I saw your article and I did what you said, but let me be the one person maybe who gets to say that to you right now. I saw your article and I got to do the things that you said. So thank you so much for doing that. Speaking of learning from and with peers, I'm involved in a 6-part series that's exploring racial capitalism. It's sponsored by Rework the Bay, and in large part, it's facilitated by an organization called Liberation in a Generation. And I've attended 3 of these sessions so far. And as a result, I've been contemplating how I, as a Black woman, have had some success in navigating racist, oppressive systems, and in some ways have benefited from them. And so I'm interested, Serena, to hear you talk about how do you reckon with your own navigation of systems that have largely disadvantaged women and people of color?
Well, I guess it's a mixed bag. I sometimes am thoughtful and rational and kind of want to keep moving the work forward, but I often get really frustrated too. And so I think that it's important, again, going back to sort of how do we shift people, I think we have to do that by calling them in, by showing them that there's a more impactful or better way, or a way of producing results that will benefit a greater number of people. And I think gender is really central to that. So for example, when funders in California have said to me, our priority is poverty, addressing poverty in California, so we don't focus on gender. And so, in the most gracious way that I can say is that if you're addressing poverty in California, the majority of people who are living in poverty in California are single moms and their kids, and they're a majority women of color. And so we have to center gender. This happened over and over again, even in our sector, with the most well-meaning people in the progressive philanthropic sector or the progressive social justice sector. So we developed a gender justice impact assessment tool just to say, what is something tangible that we can offer, and even really begin by using ourselves. We're one of the conveners of the California Gender Justice Funders Network. And so through that group of funders that includes Blue Shield of California Foundation, the California Endowment, Fondation Chanel, the Libra Foundation, and others, we, came up with this tool that basically asks a series of questions, starting with, what issue is being addressed by the proposed policy, program, effort, or intervention. It can be widely used, whether in grant making or, for us, even in terms of thinking about when we were meeting in person, where were we ordering catering from? Were we supporting women of color-led businesses? And we weren't all the time. Now we do all the time. So, we want to know, does the organization, project, business, or entity, effort, is it women or women of color led? Is it led by trans, gender nonconforming, or gender non-binary people? What percentage of cisgender, transgender women, LGBTQ people, and people of color are in leadership positions at staff and board governance levels? Do cisgender and trans women have a decision-making role? What feminist policies are instituted in human resources, investments, and banking? And then finally, the last question I think is perhaps one of the most important questions, which is, does the potential partner or vendor represent interests that are in opposition to racial, economic, and gender justice? And that was a real eye-opener for me, even as I wrote it, because I began to look at a number of different things. And by way of example, in addition to all these other things that we have done in the past year that have really centered the wellness of our team and our partners, and then has therefore resulted in, we've outperformed kind of every goal that we've set, whether they were fundraising goals, grant making goals, programs that we have shifted. So it wasn't just that we were able to hold the line, but we were able to make other advancements in our work. And those are one of the next things that I want to write about by way of, helping other people through what we have done is in our fiscal management. So for example, we have for a long time invested our funds in social impact funds, investment funds. And we, I think back around 2011, developed with US Trust a women and girls equality strategy that we're really proud of and really happy with. And it consistently performed well, better, on average about 1% better than the S&P. But what I realized through this last question is it was a good strategy in a bad system. And so, when we looked at, we were banking with Bank of America, we had our investments with US Trust. It was not a diverse team. It was an all-white investment team. And so we began to we've made some changes this past year. We moved our banking from Bank of America to Beneficial State Bank. And at the time we were looking at Beneficial or Amalgamated, both very progressive banks. But when you use this tool, you see that one is led by a woman and the other is not. So that made our decision easy. We moved our investment portfolio to NIA Impact Advisors, women-led. It's a diverse team of investment advisors. We moved our retirement from our, 2 white investment advisors to a people of color, women-led firm. So these are the kinds of things that it's allowed us to do. And furthermore, one of the other things that we did over the last year that's been really wonderful is to send monthly care packages to our team. And it's both about taking care of the team, but also it's about supporting women of color owned businesses when we're in a time when so many small businesses are struggling, that it's another way that we can support. So I think that, using this kind of tool is a tangible way of moving forward. We hope to launch it publicly. We've gotten some good feedback on it. And so that's the kind of thing that I think helps in terms of when you see that people are not, centering gender and race in the way that we really need people to do in this moment.
I am really looking forward to these tools being public, Serena. Getting to hear about them from you has certainly sparked and refined my own thinking. I'd like to take a moment and use our polling tools to, turn to everyone who's with us now to ask a couple of questions. And again, we'll be able to see the group response on our screen. The first one asks us to take a look at practices that center race and gender. And so on a scale from 1 to 5, you'll respond to a couple of questions where 1 means not at all, 5 means yes, always, and those middle 2 to 3 indicates that you're a work in progress. And so you see the questions there now. My organization adopted a racial equity screening tool in 2020 or previously. My organization adopted a gender justice screening tool in 2020 or previously. My organization uses a racial and/or gender equity screen for internal operations.
as people are filling that out, I see that there's a lot of potential to do more work in this area. One of the benefits that we've seen when you use these screens with intention and set some, and center values, we have been at Women's Foundation California. I think, my history with the foundation goes back to 2004 when I initially began here as a volunteer. But what I understand is that we've always had a practice of being majority women of color led at the board level and now certainly at the staff level over the years. At the board level, one of the things that we did, again, to sort of deepen and advance our commitment and institutionalize this practice that we had, was we changed our bylaws to say, and this was initiated by the board, to say we've had a practice of being, majority women of color led, but let's institutionalize that and make sure that it continues, into the future forever. And so it took us a while to come up with the language, but it basically says something like, we strive to be reflective of California's communities. And so in addition to race and ethnicity, it actually deepened our analysis around, for example, and commitment to having Indigenous people on our board, issues around disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender expression and identity. And so it allows us to really be intentional and thoughtful about the variety of experiences that we want on our team. And I'm happy to say that we're, I think around close to 90% women of color or people of color led on the board, and similarly on the staff, certainly on the leadership team, but also on the full staff. And so it's like anything else, you just have to practice and then you get results.
Right. Well, we definitely saw in that first question that we have some room to grow, and thankfully your tools will help us with that. Let's ask a second question. This one is multiple choice. You should see it appear on the screen. Oh, there it is. My organization has gender inclusive policies. Let's see. I'd just like to add, while people are responding to these questions, obviously we're asking these questions without any judgment whatsoever, that this is not a pass-fail test. This is an opportunity for us to take a snapshot of where we are now and think about where we'd like to go in the future.
I see this question in the chat that is a tool, just a way of saying you ensure that there is more representation of POC/women. And I think it helps. A tool is a way to help you get where you want to go. So if your goal is to have more representation of people of color and women, a tool like this gender justice impact assessment tool can help you do that. Or, for us, it's really much more far-reaching than that. It's about making sure that we are funding women of color-led efforts, that we are inclusive of gender identity, that we are, all of our vendors represent our commitment to women of color-led organizations. So for us, it's much more kind of comprehensive, and the tool helps us do that.
Thanks for that. Often, Serena, when you talk about decision-making at the foundation, you said us, you say we, you say the team, you say we talked. Tell us a little bit about your staff meetings. Like, how are they structured? How have they changed? How do they reflect the new understandings and align with your values?
Yeah, well, they are evolving just like our work. But initially, last March, we as I mentioned, we happen to have a regularly scheduled staff meeting just as we were going to working virtually. And so we asked, the first thing I said was, we're no longer doing business as usual. So what does business as unusual look like? And prior to that, we would always question the status quo. So we're kind of like, it's been an evolution. So let me start prior to COVID. The status quo will tell you, like let's say in hiring practices, we all have probably applied for jobs or seen job listings that say BA required, graduate degree preferred. Well, and so we had that too. I mean, it was just BA required, graduate degree preferred. And, but then when you overlay that with our philosophy and commitment to people closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. Well, if we want to transform the criminal justice system, it might be somebody who has experience with the criminal justice system, who might have the best ideas, and maybe for issues to do with poverty or other kinds of things never got to finish their degree. Doesn't mean that they might not have some of the best ideas. So we did away with, we talk about experience, not degrees. We think education is really important. It's not to minimize that, but that there's a lot of different kinds of people that have solutions. Another, status quo was salary commensurate with experience, and that's still happening in a lot of places. We started listing the salary range because we believe that people should get paid for what the position pays, not based on what they made in their previous position, because that actually is one of the greatest contributors to the gender wage gap.
Right.
So in terms of your question around staff meeting, initially when I said, what does business as unusual look like? The staff, we had a conversation, and there's 19 of us on the team, said, let's meet weekly. So in the beginning, we started meeting weekly, and we still do on Zoom. And, a lot of the time was just spent kind of checking in. How are you doing? How did you cope, through the last week? People have kids that they're helping with distance learning. And then over time, then that was taking a long time because there were 19 of us. So we thought maybe we try breakout sessions because, you can do that in Zoom. And people really liked that. So we're just kind of checking in. There's kind of a constant feedback loop, and we're used to that as well as a public foundation. We are accountable to the public that we work with, support, or that supports us. And so we're always looking for input and feedback, and we bring that practice into the way that we work together. Now, a year later, since then, we were using the poll function in Zoom to talk about, what do we do with this office that we're paying a lot of money for every month in rent? Should we give it up? So we did a poll, and we asked people, questions like, I prefer to work from home all the time. I prefer to work from home some of the time. I want to work from the office all the time. And we did it at, different times as we were trying to make this decision. And ultimately what we learned over time is that most people really like working from home. Not everybody, so it might be, so we have given up the office, which is, when you talk about sort of what are you leaving behind. We are in the process this month of getting everything out of the office and just finishing that up and being a completely virtual organization. Not to say that we won't go back to having some kind of physical space in the future, but it won't look like it did in the past. It'll look different because, we're truly now actually a statewide organization. Some of us, myself included, my partner and I were, often living apart because of our jobs. Now we're together. And so and that's been true for others on our staff who have, were living separated from their partners because they felt like they had to be close to the office. Well, the work can get done. And it is getting done well, as we can see. We have measures for that are just very clear. And so again, when we think about wellness, I think that what I'm coming to really appreciate is that when people's home lives are good, then their work lives are also good or better. And so for us, we're leaving behind the office, but we talk about it as a team and just, solicit input at various ways, either at staff meeting. Now we're talking about, we had I think the turn of a calendar year for us is both the middle of our fiscal year as well as the beginning of a new calendar year. So it's a good time to take stock and reflect and think about hopes for the future. So we talked about, let's celebrate, what are some accomplishments that people have, and we used new technology, something called Padlet, and everybody went in there and jotted down their notes, so we have like a record of it, and then we talked about the future, and we all, I think, are really interested in being a much more, integrated organization, and so that meant that we thought about staff meetings and how could we, change them. So now rather than people we were giving updates about what each team had done, in the last week or month or whatever, we're still doing that in terms of being, creating a atmosphere of celebration. But we're really thinking about looking ahead, so everybody knows what's happening and that we all feel part of this greater whole while we're maybe working on our specific things. And we're just continuing to experiment with the breakouts. We're rotating facilitation. That was a suggestion that came up, so that everybody gets an opportunity to help craft the meetings and bring their ideas forward to it. So we do really try to, it's a very team-centered approach.
All of those are really great examples. Thank you for sharing that. I have a little bit of a personal question for you, Serena. Every time I see you, every time we interact, you are always grounded and calm, no matter what might be going on around you. Do you experience anxiety, overwhelm, doubt when you, if you do, because I don't know that you do, I've never seen it. If you do, what do you do? I'm asking for a friend.
I absolutely do. But I think, I've heard this over the years since I was a kid, that I'm a very calm person, and that, people wondered, like, is it because my mother named me Serena, not that it's spelled in the same way as serene. So I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and so I think I observed, I'm an observer, I kind of hang back. I'm naturally actually shy. I have to train myself to be outgoing in the way that this role requires. And so as a kid, I just remember kind of observing and seeing some of the challenges or mistakes or whatever you want to call it when my siblings got in trouble, and thinking to myself, I gonna try to avoid that so that I don't have to experience, so there's something in that. But absolutely, I think I'm a naturally calm person, but I do experience anxiety, especially over the last several years. I think I, experienced it over the last year in particular, not even knowing what it might have been about. I just sometimes would say I feel anxious today, and I think it's just about everything that's happening in the world. Sometimes it would be anxiety that was very much related to work. The early years of, being in this position were very difficult and stressful for me. And so I do feel anxiety, and I do feel overwhelmed. And actually, I was feeling, just coming into this, I was feeling today, I'm feeling a sense of overwhelm, but maybe it's in a good maybe it's a good overwhelm, So for me, what I try to do is to listen to my anxiety and to listen to the overwhelm, and I try to understand maybe what is it trying to tell me. And so sometimes the overwhelm, it might be important to kind of allow yourself to feel it, because it might be saying to you, you need to slow down, or maybe you need to ask for help. So these are, I think, important emotions and feelings that we have, just like, our bodies tell us other things, like when we're thirsty or hungry. So it's important to listen to those emotions, but absolutely I feel them. And I think that I try to breathe, really pay attention to my breathing, breathe deeply, take deep breaths. There's science that says that if you take a deep breath, your brain will send positive energy to your body. So sometimes I say I need my brain to send positive energy to my body, and I just take a few deep breaths, and that helps. And then also, you know, for me, I've noticed lately, and this is true, that these are the sort of silver linings on COVID, is that because we're at home, I'm spending a lot less time traveling and commuting. And so I have, for the first time perhaps in my life, I've had fits and starts with trying to have like a regular exercise schedule. And now I have a regular exercise schedule. And so I feel strong in my body, I feel strong in my mind. And I think it's important for us to hang on to what good has come out of this past year. And that again comes back to this theme of wellness, and, you know, operating with a sense of abundance and generosity. And it really, you know, it's been a real lesson for me over the last year that it's so important to center that.
Yeah, I want to stay on this theme for a moment. For the folks on the call who are NCG members, perhaps you attended NCG's annual meeting last year. Valerie Kaur was a keynote speaker, and I think soon after she spoke at the NCG annual meeting, she published a book called See No Stranger. And in it, she talks about, Valerie Kaur is an attorney and an activist and a faith leader who's very active in social justice movements. And in the book, she talks about how as an activist and an organizer, she never felt like she was doing her job unless she was exhausted, depleted, suffering, and, you know, just always fighting. And that she has since come to realize that rest and joy and love and fun are just as important to movement building and to her own sustainability as being in the fight. So how do you think about the relationship between your own well-being, mental, emotional, physical, and social change, social justice work?
I mean, that story really resonates with me because I think that's been my experience as well, of just, you know, working hard. And that has always been important to me because of sort of the gravity of the kinds of, you know, movement shifts that we're trying to make. And yet when you take, and we also in social justice, gender justice, racial justice movements talk about the importance of investing for the long term. And so we have to invest in ourselves. And I think the more that we center joy and fun and wellness and back that up with policies and practices, then it is an investment in the long term. So for example, another one of the things that I've noticed in the last year is that we have had no staff turnover. And that's important because that is an investment, that's an investment in the long term that, you know, we have historical knowledge on the team. We have relationships on the team in terms of the way that people work together. And I think that's because one of our staff members said I think in a either convening or community gathering or staff meeting, that just as we center trust with our grant partners, we also have a trust-based management with our staff. And so we trust that people will bring their best forward. But if that means that, you know, I found myself probably every week over the last year saying, please do what you need to do to take care of yourselves and your loved ones, whether, you know, because of COVID or because of the insurrection on January 6th. These are very heavy times. And so I've just asked people to please take care of themselves. Even with the inauguration, I've said, you know, we took election day as a holiday. We didn't think to call the inauguration as a holiday, but I knew that my mind and probably everybody else's mind was going to be on the inauguration. So I said, please give yourselves permission to not work tomorrow if you can, or if you feel that working is the way for you to get it through. Like each of us, we don't all have one way of being, but sort of to center that kind of flexibility and allow people. So some people, you know, they might be putting in work time after they put the kids to bed. I don't know. But they have, you know, organizational practice and permission to, you know, say, I need to go, I need to take the afternoon off, or I need to go pick up my kid. Or so that's sort of feminist, you know, as a women's organization, we have to bring those feminist principles forward too and model the kinds of policies and practices that we want others to have. So another change that we made recently was, we see opportunities certainly with the Biden-Harris administration to, move forward on gender equity issues like childcare, paid leave, equal pay and raising the minimum wage, reproductive health, protection around gender identity and expression. And so for us, we should model what we can in terms of the feminist future we want to see in California. So one of the changes that we've made, and I know there'll be more coming as we continue to talk as a team, but we increased our family leave to up to 6 months. With 4 months paid, and then the other 2 that you can take through this, either through your, vacation, sick, or state disability plan. And so, I don't know that that's even enough, given what you see some other countries in Scandinavia doing, but it's progress, and it's more than the state mandates, and it's more than a lot of people give, and not as much as some are allowed to do. The other thing that I wanted to say, I forgot to mention, is when I was talking about our fiscal practices, we also, use this tool to think about our funding relationships. And so we paused funding relationships with 2 corporate funding partners over the past year, JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, to do with both, racial and gender discrimination within the firms, but also in the case of Wells Fargo, what we saw as a divestment in local community organizations. And so it's important, I think, for us to put that story out there as well. I know that not everybody is in a position to be able to turn down funding, but I think that the more of us that are able to and can talk about it, it can push better practices at that level, as it has done with JP Morgan Chase. They've made now, after many conversations. Again, we did it in a way that was not, finger pointy and waggy, but to say, we want to support you to make some changes, and here are the ideas that we have. We had conversations with their leadership through our participation in closing the women's wealth gap, and we think it made a difference in terms of the investments that they have now committed to in terms of racial justice.
I want to stay here for a moment and look. Actually, I want to look to the future for a moment, but you were already starting to talk about the future. So I'd like to wave Mara's magic wand. Mara is on the call today, and she waves a magic wand from time to time. I'd like to wave Mara's magic wand and fast forward us to December 31, 2022. So we're nearly 2 years into a new administration. We've got new leadership at many foundations, in philanthropic service organizations and affinity groups and communities in California. What's different because of intersectional feminist leadership principles?
Well, I think, much like I just spoke about, I think we will have access to affordable childcare. We will have a living wage. We will have access to quality education and healthcare that's accessible. We will hopefully see an end to gender-based violence and discrimination. And I hope that we will see more representative leadership, whether it's in the highest offices in the state or the land, or in philanthropy. So we still have this problem of women being underrepresented, and especially women of color in leadership positions. So we should so much celebrate Vice President Kamala Harris being the first woman and woman of color to be the Vice President of the United States. In California, we've never had a woman governor. Our pro tem president of the Senate, Toni Atkins, is the first woman to hold that position. We no longer have a Black woman in the Senate of the United States. It's great that, California sent a Latino man, Senator Alex Padilla, but we were really hoping and calling on the governor to appoint a woman of color, and in particular a Black woman, given what we're seeing in this country. We need more women of color to lead. And so I hope in 2 years we will see a significant difference, given that there is some momentum, though in my opinion, we have a long ways to go there.
I'm going to turn now and start looking at the questions, some of the questions that have been submitted through the chat and the Q&A function. And at the same time, I'd like to invite anyone who has a question to either put that in chat or the Q&A. Here's a question from Minnie. She says, I apologize for gendering you, Minnie. We've not met before and I should not have done that. Please excuse me. Minnie says, we have a generous donor advisor who has provided thousands of dollars of scholarships to youth who live in poverty in our county, pardon me. However, this donor advisor also requests that we verify citizenship. Many of our students are not US citizens. I am torn. On the one hand, we appreciate the generosity. On the other, it seems like a racist, discriminatory practice to have to identify citizenship. I think this is an institutional philanthropy question. Thoughts?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I wonder, my first thought is I wonder if this was one of those sort of things that we default to and sort of part of our status quo, where even as recently as last week, I think, I posted on Facebook that I, was wondered if anybody needed to sort of decrease or monitor their news intake. And so I got a lot of responses for that. And one of them said, absolutely not. As citizens, we have to be concerned about what's happening. And, my response to that was citizens, immigrants, undocumented people all need access to information. And so I think that person was not being, I don't think they meant citizen in the sense of that you have to hold a US passport, but we are so used to talking that way that so I wonder, I would want to ask this donor is what is the interest in verifying citizenship when we have so many young people who are have so much potential and possibility ahead of them to make our communities better? Would we not be interested in investing in those people too? What is the interest in verifying citizenship? Because I do think that I think it's morally wrong, but I think strategically it's missing the mark in the sense of what could be possible when we fund people despite their papers.
Thank you. Another question here from Connie Malloy. Hi, Connie. I'm so glad you're here. So Serena, how do you get the information you need from your diligence process, your screening and decision-making without putting additional burdens on your grantee partners? If you read that really beautiful note from one of your partners, what makes that experience possible?
Well, I think it's a number of things. So if we don't know, in many cases, we know the partners really well because we've been in relationship with them for a long time. So for example, we were the first funder of California Latinas for Reproductive Justice when they were founded in 2005. Similarly with the Community Water Center. So as a public foundation, I think, we're able to take some risks in ways that maybe other foundations are not. But we recognized back then in 2005 when Susana de Anda and Laurel Firestone, two, leaders, came to us with a great idea, untested, no funding, no investments in their leadership, and we thought there's something here, and so there's this sort of like art and science to philanthropy, and we made a $5,000 grant, and now Laurel Firestone is, part of the Water Resources Board. They're a multi-million-dollar organization that have really made big impacts on issues of access to clean water in California, which is a real issue. So I say that because, you know, so we know with Community Water Center and other organizations that we've been in long-term relationships with, we just have to follow their work to know that they're being impactful. And so the onus is on us to follow their work, whether it's, you know, things that communications that they're putting out, going to their website, going to their convenings. And then in other cases where organizations are newer to us, it really starts with a conversation. So again, we put the onus on ourselves to be listening and then writing up what we're learning rather than putting the burden on them to explain their work. So, so that, you know, and we do offer for the ones that would prefer to, you know, continue to write up an application, they can. But I think I'm struck by the fact that we have, you know, philanthropy has in some ways trained the sector to do things the way that we have wanted them to for a long time. So when I came into this position, we reworded like the, on the website, we said we prefer to make general operating support grants. We will also consider project support grants. I thought maybe that would get the message across. Well, when we got the applications, they were probably 90% of them were for project support, and I was shocked. And so it showed to me that they thought, sure, they're saying that, but will I be more competitive if I, you know? So we went back to each one of them and said, just to be sure, wouldn't you prefer a general operating support grant? And they said, well, yes, we would. So I think, you know, I don't know, Connie, if I'm answering your question exactly, but I think that we really have to put the onus on ourselves to, you know, in terms of understanding their financial health rather than having them explain it to us. Go read the 990 and, you know, study that and then see what questions that brings up in terms of the story rather than, you know, asking them to fill out a budget template that's going to be easy for us to read when they present their financials in a different way. So it's, you know, I think it starts again with everything else. It's about relationships and trust, and that sometimes it takes a little time to develop.
I'd like to add another word to this conversation, love. I have increasingly heard you reference love when you talk about your work. What role does love play in philanthropy, aside from being its root word? What does love look like in philanthropy?
Well, I mean, for me, I come to this work because I love it, in the sense of it means something to me to make a difference in the world. And so I think, you know, approaching the work with love, in terms of love of justice, in terms of love of generosity, love of making sure that the people around me are cared for, and well, that, you know, that matters. And I think we need to foreground it more in many ways. So, and I do see it more and more. And I think that, you know, I think that it's interesting for us in terms of institutional philanthropy to look at the ways, you know, kind of going back to, you know, like as individuals, we give money, we give donations where we see the need or where we love an organization and we love what they're doing and we are energized by what they're doing. And we just, you know, however we're making our donations these days, by credit card, on the website, writing a check, Venmo, we don't require them to send us a written application when we make a donation, because we trust and we love the work. And so I think that there's lessons there because there are not as many legal requirements. You know, we're putting the burden on ourselves in many ways, and that burden is then being, you know, filtered down to the organizations that we're wanting to support by these, you know, rigorous application processes that are not actually legally required. I think, you know, we have to prove something to our boards, maybe, and I think that that's different for private philanthropy and public philanthropy. Our board is made up of, speaking of being values centered as well, of community leaders and high wealth individuals. There's a lot of diversity. We're certainly, as I mentioned before, primarily women of color led, but we have some of our WPI fellows, people like Kim Carter, Arya Saeed, are on our board. And so that brings a level of realness, I think, just in terms of how we go about our work, because they are also in the position of seeking funding. And so it just brings this level of innovation. And again, what is business is unusual. We don't have to do things the way we've always done them.
Great, thank you. Just want to remind everyone here that if you have a question, please put that in the chat box or in Q&A. Please also know that I'm happy to be greedy with the time that we have left because I really love talking to you, Serena, and I'm always inspired by our conversations. I have another question for you, again, thinking about things I've heard you say in the past. You've described your team as working in a way to create a masterpiece together. What does that mean?
Well, actually, this was another person on our team in our last staff meeting of the year, when we talked about our reflections and our hopes for the new year. One of our team members said, and it just was so moving and meaningful to me, that she really felt that we were all creating this incredible masterpiece together. And so when you're creating a masterpiece, if you think about the masterpieces in the world, of art or music, when you're creating something like that together, you really want to bring your best to it because you see something beautiful emerging. And that's what she felt we were doing together. And that meant the world to me, because ultimately that is what I am striving for, that everybody sees that we're kind of working towards. To me, I hadn't even put it in those kind of eloquent words. I just thought if we all are kind of working towards the same North Star and we know we're rowing in the same direction, that's the way that I was thinking about it. But it's just beautiful to bring that language of love and beauty into the work that we do, and to think that we're creating something amazing together. And that means that we're all going to be motivated and want to be part of it and put our part, to this collective thing that we're creating together. So I think it means that, we have to create openings for people to bring forward their ideas, which is one of the things, like, we said, let's have different people run staff meetings because there might be different ways of doing it. And also just to encourage cross-team collaboration, that, development folks might have some really interesting ideas about programs, or vice versa. And so where there's opportunities to innovate and co-create, let's do that, because we all have different ideas, and contributions, no matter what our actual function in the organization might be.
Mm-hmm. That's been one of the silver linings for us at the Walter and Lee's Haas Fund. I think that I talk about, like, talent over titles, that there was so much work to do, and we needed to act and adjust our behaviors in so many different ways, that building our masterpiece really became about making sure that people with the interest and the skills and the passion were had the power on their own to take on pieces of work. And it didn't necessarily matter what a title was. It didn't necessarily matter what program you were supposed to work in. What mattered was being responsive to the community and continuing to advance the fund's work during a really difficult time. And I really appreciate having had that experience with my team. And that's definitely something that we're going to carry forward with us, into 2021 and beyond. Hi, Jennifer. I'm really glad that you're here. Thank you so much for your question. Jennifer's question is, the work ahead and efforts towards cultural change will take time. How can philanthropy support women leaders of color so they can stay engaged for the long term? How can foundations support and invest in, I'm going to say, women leaders, perhaps as part of their grant making? Are there opportunities to provide support for women leaders of color to invest in themselves?
I'm so glad you asked that question, Jennifer. Absolutely. I think that in addition to some of the things that we've talked about in terms of just, leading with trust and generosity and abundance, general support, making it easy, listening, putting some of the onus on ourselves. There's something else that we're pondering and is in our strategic framework for the next 3 years. And it came out of, again, listening to our community partners. We invited for one of our board meetings in, I think, 2019, Eunices Hernandez, who's now also on our board, and Diana Zuniga, who are 2 Women's Policy Institute alums. And they led a coalition in Los Angeles that was successful in reallocating $3 billion, 3 billion with a B, from the LA County budget that was allocated to build a new jail, to reallocate that to mental health and community services. So that now passed as Measure J in the most recent election. And it was just such an incredible success. It was the way that they described it, a David and Goliath story, because they were these young activists, and they began to recognize themselves as the experts. And part of that came from the Policy Institute training. They built an incredible coalition, and the Construction Workers Union was opposed to their request of the County Board of Supervisors. And so they met with the Construction Workers Union, who said, you're trying to take jobs away from us. We were going to build this jail. And they said, look, we come from union families. We don't want you to stop building things. We just want you to stop building bad things. We want you to build good things. And over time, they won the support of the Construction Workers Union. They built this major coalition, and they had this massive success. And so when we heard the story, it was just incredible. You could see, our board members just being in awe of what they were able to do. And one of our board members asked them, the same question, Jennifer, that you're asking, what do you need to stay in this for the long term? And they didn't ask for this, but it came to me in listening to their response, which is that we should think about how can we be even more generous. And so one of the things that we thought that we could begin to figure out how to do is to give some kind of, I don't know what we'll call them, but for lack of a better word right now, like restorative grants, where you just give no strings attached grants to community leaders for them to do whatever they need to do for their own wellness. And that could be, whether they take themselves out to dinner or get massages, or in the case when I did run this by AUNIS, is to say, your response sparked this idea, what do you think? And for us, as a relatively small public community foundation, we're thinking of something in the sort of like $30,000 range. And she said, that would be incredible. And for her, like, she was trying to save up to buy a car, so like for her, it might be like, oh, I'm going to buy a car, and that will allow me to do this work for longer, or maybe to take a self-funded sabbatical, or, something that allows you to regenerate. And for everybody, that's different. And I see a question, would those grants be to individuals? And they would. And so that's what we have to figure out how to do with our finance team in terms of how we would make those grants in terms of the nuts and bolts of it. That is great to see, Caitlin. So there's resources out there. People are already doing this, but and I think it starts with asking the community leaders, what do you need to stay in this for the long term? Because burnout in this sector is real. And so if we can figure out how to center wellness so that people feel restored over time and for periods of time, then we can all stay in the work longer.
Yeah. I'd add to the list that Caitlin just put in the chat, Family Independence Initiative. During last year, during the pandemic, Family Independence Initiative, FII, started a relief fund that provided direct cash assistance to low-income families, focusing on immigrant families and those who were undocumented in particular. And as an outgrowth of that work, this year, FII will be launching a program to provide grants to individual social justice leaders. I believe I think they'll be $3,500 each. The program isn't fully formed, but that's what they're thinking right now. So that's another example of an organization that is moving in this direction to provide resources to individual leaders and support their work as well as their wellness. Earlier today, Serena, I attended, this is another reference to Valerie Kaur. She's organized what she called the People's Inauguration today, essentially asking those of us who live in this country to take our own oath, to take responsibility for preserving dignity and justice and love in the country. And I got to hear, lots of amazing speakers today. You would have been fantastic at that event. We should make sure that you're, in the lineup for the next Valerie Kaur event. But one of the reflective practices that those of us who were attending were asked to do was to ask ourselves, who am I? Who taught me about myself, and do I believe it? And I'd like to pose those questions to you right now.
Who am I? And then what was the?
Who am I? Who taught me about myself, and do I believe it?
Yeah. Who am I? I am so many things. I am an immigrant, I'm a lesbian, I'm a woman, I'm a philanthropist, I'm a social justice, gender justice, racial justice worker. And so many people taught me, I think perhaps starting with my mother, as many of us do. She herself was a philanthropist. I remember coming home one day. We came to the United States from Pakistan. It wasn't a classic immigrant story, so I went back there for my junior high school years, and I came home and there were all these school children in our driveway, and my mother had started feeding them lunch. She would make a pot of lentils and some naan and give them some good protein and carbohydrates, because she noticed that they would walk by our house every day looking malnourished, and these were very, kids living in deep poverty. And so she started feeding them, but it was hard. Like, they wouldn't just come in because you were offering food. So she had to sort of reach out. She did outreach to the parents. And ultimately, every day, there would be like 40 kids in the driveway. And over time, over a short period of time, they started looking healthier. And so you could see the difference that her generosity was making. But it didn't stop there. What she started to see and advocate for with like the World Health Organization and the World Food Bank is that every child should have a hot lunch at school. And that would be good, their nutrition, but also it would keep money in the pockets of their families if we could just provide a hot lunch at school. And that's an effort that is still going on. I know Kat Taylor is working on that right here in California. And so that was really an eye-opening experience for me. I was young when I saw my mother doing this, but she, and then so many other people who, when I talk about movement, means that, we have to move people. There are people who moved me with their vision. My family was also conservative. They were registered Republicans here in the United States. I registered as a Republican when I turned 18. And in my first presidential election, I voted for George Bush Sr. And over time, people moved me with their vision. And I, through my own personal identity of coming out as a lesbian, saw that that was not the party for me. But there's been changes over time. And so I think it's important, those are important lessons for me over time. Thank you for asking that question.
Serena, thank you for letting us get to know you a little bit better today. Thank you for advancing gender and racial justice in your work and providing a model for many of us how we can join you in that work. I have so enjoyed getting to talk with you today and would like now to turn the mic back over to Caitlin for her closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Always a pleasure.
I am just filled with gratitude to both of you for the huge hearts and just personal disclosure that you brought to this conversation, and admire your compassion and your strength both. I am grateful for my colleague Neptali Ramirez leading us on the tech support. And there was so much here, and we will definitely send out the recording and some follow-up resources. I just want to close us out with the words that Amanda Gorman, our National Youth Poet Laureate, spoke yesterday. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. So my encouragement is that we be part of the repairing, the evolving, of bringing forth the love with justice, of moving people with our vision, as Serena said. And with that, I want to wish you all a good evening and go well. Take care.
Thank you so much.